Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's cybersecurity seminar. For those I have not yet met, my name is Mike Brennan. I am the director of the UNSW Institute for Cybersecurity. Allow me to acknowledge on your behalf the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to all those present here. Let me introduce now today's speaker and topic. Professor Andrew Goldsmith will talk to us about the rise of ransomware from a criminal tool to a state-sponsored cyber instrument. Amy will monitor the questions via the Q&A area in Zoom, and I'll just note that what we are doing is recording this session for later playback by people. That will be up on the web as soon as we can reasonably do that. Let's go on from there. Andrew, if you begin, and then we will take a period of questions, which will be possibly a little rough to start, as the three of us are now experts at Zoom. Andrew's had full 15 minutes, and we've had about an hour and 15 minutes of practice. Andrew, over to you. I'm going to mute.
Okay. I'm just sharing my screen now. Hopefully everybody can see that. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Let me just say a little bit about who I am. I'm Andrew Goldsmith. I'm Emeritus Professor of Criminology at Leeds University in Adelaide. Previously, I was the Executive Director of the Centre for Transnational Crime Prevention at University of Wollongong. The background to this presentation is, I guess, a long-standing interest of mine in transnational crime and organised crime. And a few years ago, I moved into the cybercrime space. And I've been leading with a colleague at Adelaide a project called Becoming Delinquent Online, which has generated a range of publications now. I've been particularly interested in how young people have got drawn into various cybercrime activities from an early age. So the realm of hacking, youth involvement in cybercrime has been something I've been looking at for the last 5 years or so under a Australian Research Council grant. More recently, this year, and in its response to events in the world, I've been involved in drafting a report on ransomware as a weapon of geopolitical conflict for a group based in Vienna and Geneva called the Global Initiative for Transnational Crime. And that paper's in draft form. It's called Weaponising Ransomware, Cybercrime as a Geo-Strategic Instrument. And what I'm talking about today will relate to that work. And it is rather formative and exploratory, I suppose. I should also say, as a criminologist, originally a lawyer by training, I'm not a natural tech head, and that may become apparent as we go along. But I have been attempting to learn as much as I can around in the last few months about this ransomware space. So what I'm talking about today is really how we know state actors, advanced persistent threat groups, have been in the kind of geopolitical space for some time. But what's interesting to me as a criminologist is how other groups in the form of cybercrime groups, ransomware gangs, have been moving into this space as well. And I'll be using the Russia and Ukraine conflict as, I guess, the kind of a case study, I suppose, and looking at how ransomware has evolved leading into and through this particular phase. And as a criminologist, I'm interested in things like how criminals organize themselves, as well as their motivations. And clearly the geopolitical space raises new issues about different motivations for involvement. But how they get sponsored, how they get funded, who they have to kind of work in hand with. And I think in the Russian context, you see some very interesting relationships between organized crime groups and the Russian state. And when I talk about the Russian state, I'll be making it clear that one has to think of the Russian state as consisting of a variety of agencies, such as the different intelligence agencies in particular. So that's the context, who I am and where this project comes from. I'm now going into, there we go. My second slide really is, I think, trying to suggest some of the complexity of the relationships where cybercrime gangs get involved in geopolitical events. And if you look at the sort of offensive cyber operations sphere, I guess, you can see a number of things going on. And this diagram, my colleague David Wall prepared, shows that, you know, there's a kind of ecosystem around cybercrime that lends itself to involvement in other spheres, including cyber warfare, as well as hacktivism, cyber espionage, and economic cybercrime. So the nature of these relationships, the common methods that are shared between criminals, other non-state actors, advanced persistent threat groups, state agencies, and people in the wider community. I guess that's the point, that when you bring criminality into the geopolitical space, you're really talking about outsourcing, I guess, cyber operations to people, often, you know, from their bedrooms, to use that hackneyed cliche. So we put the notion of ransomware as a weapon in the context of an example of offensive cyber operations. The Microsoft report that looked at the Ukraine situation earlier this year has looked at how these variety, all cyber operations are directed to degrade, disrupt, and discredit the Ukrainian government, as well as its economic foundations and critical infrastructure. And I guess the importance of a lot of ransomware as a weapon comes up in this context of its impact on critical infrastructure. And I guess in the context of other kinds of cyber operations, one of the questions is, what's the role of ransomware? And I guess one can think of other forms of offensive cyber operations, some of which are more common more frequent. But the point about ransomware is what's unique about its features. Why would you pick ransomware in this sort of context? And I guess that's one of the things I'll try and talk about as well. But the idea that ransomware can be particularly strategically damaging, more so than state cyber spying, is one of the sort of, I guess, foundations for this exploration. When you look at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict and Eastern Europe generally, I think most of us probably know that cyber operations, cyber activity of a malicious, criminal, disruptive kind has been going on for some time. If you look at Eastern Europe and the sort of Russian sensitivity, I guess, to events in that space, one can go back to Estonia in 2007. The Estonian government said they were going to move a statue of a Russian soldier, and immediately there was this initially sort of dispersed set of cyber attacks on various Estonian sites, government sites and others. And attribution, which is always a problem in this space, particularly when you bring criminal groups in, and there's often a rationale, I guess, for use of criminal groups right there. But you can see that there was this, if you like, nexus formed between a political decision in Tallinn in Estonia and then a sort of pro-Russian footprint in terms of a variety of cyber attacks. And it's interesting that the cyber attacks kind of ended soon after the Victory Day for the Russian Federation in 2007. So you've got this tradition in Eastern Europe of political use of cyber. If we go to this slide here, produced with my colleague David Wall, tracking cyber activity over the first 5 months of this year, you can see that obviously there's two sides to cyber conflict. It's not just, if you like, Russian-oriented groups attacking Ukrainian groups, etc. There's pushback from pro-Ukrainian groups as well. But this shows you the variety of cyber operations. And, you know, it's worth noting here that ransomware is merely one of those potential forms of cyber operations, sitting there at 9%. Your basic hacks, your DDoS attacks are more frequent in number. And it shows that an increase in attacks really before the invasion, or the special military operation, as the Russians have called it, in Ukraine on the 24th of February, and a kind of easing off, I guess, through March down to through to May this year. So there's been a peak in that behaviour. And as I said, ransomware is just really one form of cyber operation that one could look at. But that's the focus, because we think it may have some specific strategic values. Another reason for picking ransomware in the current climate is in the lead up to what's happened in Ukraine this year. Ransomware became a national security issue last year in a number of Western jurisdictions. A number of statements by leaders, including Joe Biden, the head of the National Cybercrime Cybersecurity Centre in the United Kingdom, Lindy Cameron, and so on. So, the thing about ransomware, is, for those who perhaps not completely across it, is that it's really a form of digital distortion, but it's a way of capturing and encrypting data and then seeking payment in exchange for the release of the decryption key. And chain analysis and others have shown a dramatic increase across the last 2 or 3 years in the frequency of ransomware and the amounts of money at stake. So as I said, it's become a national security item for America, for the United States, the United Kingdom, and so on. Another point, I guess, that's become apparent in this recent upswelling ransomware attacks is that about 75% of them are linked by experts, observers, to having some kind of Russian connection. So if you're looking at different kinds of cyber operations and ransomware, Russia's connections feature very prominently. Well, I'm going to say something about the different groups that are involved in Russian ransomware operations as I proceed. But I think one of the interesting issues from the paper we produced is how criminal groups have sort of oriented themselves politically in the context of what's going on in the Ukrainian situation. In the day after the Russian launch of its invasion, 24th of February, the Conti group, and I'll be saying more about the Conti group as one of the preeminent ransomware groups out of Russia, issued a statement about it really announcing its alignment with Russian interests in the context of that dispute. And of course, it's interesting to look at the language and so on, but if you like, and I'll come back to this point, the enemy in this is interesting. And who are the targets for ransomware attacks, and how do they relate to some understanding of a cyber conflict or, if you like, traditional warfare? And of course, the West is a concept that gets used a lot in Russian rhetoric around who's the enemies of the Russian people, the Russian state. And here the Conti group has picked up on that and is saying it will use its ransomware in a sense as retaliation against people who launch attacks on the Russians. So this announcement of ransomware in a political space is visible there in February this year. To understand ransomware and as crime in the Russian context, you need to know something about, I guess, crime in Russia prior to the sort of upsurge in the use of cyber in the 2000s and much more recently. And it's fair to say that, the state in Russia has had a long association with criminality. Some people would say it goes back to 1917. Others would say it's gone up, spiked dramatically since the end of the Soviet Union. One consequence of the end of the Soviet Union is the release of a lot of trained men with military and cyber skills onto a market where there's very little legitimate demand or economic opportunities for them. And through the 90s, under Yeltsin, and then more recently under Putin, I think that the rise of criminal associations with political figures has taken place. But significantly, I think, for the argument where I'm running today is that with the rise of Putin, which goes back to 1999, what you see is the Kremlin under his direction has been really kind of claw back some of the kind of wild west of capitalism of the 1990s, and to put people under control that were in the 1990s running amok or running free as business and crime leaders. So that since Putin's ascendancy, one sees a greater, if you like, state interest in reclaiming control and, more significantly, reclaiming wealth from some of these alternative sources of economic development. So there's a degree of autonomy that was given to these groups, crime groups, business people, and I think, I can see through various means that's been clawed back now, and crime is one sphere where that's visible. Mike asked me to suggest some reading for people interested more in this space, and one of the books that I think has been useful to me and many people in the study of cybercrime particularly in the Russian context, but not just the Russian context. It is worth making this point that offensive cyber operations are not limited to the Russian space. We know that North Korea, Iran, and China are engaged in this space, but I'm focusing today on Russia. In fact, but speaking of China, if you've been reading the paper today, you'll see that the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan seems to have triggered a rash of DDoS attacks out of China into Taiwan in the last 24, 48 hours. So this theme, I think, is very live, of course, but I don't know about any particular criminal component of this recent attacks. I think it's been more directed from the heart of the China state, from what the press suggests. But Russian cybercrime groups, for various reasons relating to the excess of young men with cyber skills underemployed in the 1990s, there's been a natural kind of recruitment base, I guess, and over time a global hub for various kinds of criminal activity. And it's worth noting that it's not just Russia, but the Ukraine itself historically has also been significant in cybercrime space. The Carter Planet started in Odessa about 20 years ago. But one of the interesting observations across this community is that they say that they know that they shouldn't be touching Russian banks or businesses because they know that they're been closed down if they stray into those areas. So that menace, that threat behind the operation of crime, including cybercrime operations, I think has been there for at least a decade during the Putin era. One of the kind of, I guess, rock stars of Russian cybercrime is this man, Evgeny Bogachev, who started operating about 12 years ago, the Game Over Zeus botnet. FBI would love to make his acquaintance. They've been offering a reward. One of the interesting questions, of course, if this is a crime, or we see cyber operations partly as criminal, how do we intervene? And I can talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. But the intelligence I've got from various grey sources and industry sources on this particular man, Bogachev, and public releases is that he's believed to be protected by the Russian intelligence service, the FSB, because he is an asset of value to that security service. And I think this, with Bogachev, you get an insight into how cyber can become assets in a strategic application. That sometimes state agencies will piggyback off the particular criminal expertise of cyber criminals. So there's a kind of a codependency between these different agencies or different actors. And we continue, or the US particularly continues to offer large six-figure rewards for these people, but for the most sake, these people are still off scot-free. So I guess the point's pretty clear now that one can have offensive cyber operations, not just by the state, but by people on behalf of the state, proxies, or what Tim Maurer calls cyber-mercenaries. And Russian state agencies, particularly the FSB, but also the military intelligence group, the GRU, are believed to kind of allow certain autonomy to these groups to do what they want to do. So you get this merging of motivations, the economic, which I think is primary behind ransomware gangs historically and currently, and then this patriotism for profit, if you like, a kind of coincidental or sideline hacktivism on behalf of the mother country and so on. And I watched a program called Cyberwarfare, SBS On Demand recently, and I think the bold-faced statement at the bottom of this slide really, I think, cuts to the heart of what I think is interesting to me as a criminologist, as a transnational criminologist. And this is a Russian hacker being interviewed on this Cyberwar program. He said, when they, referring to the Russian agencies, asked me to do something, he says, I won't have a choice. So you've got this, as I say, interesting, I guess, sphere of semi-autonomy, but with ultimately some degree of menace from the Russian state sitting behind there, or menace from at least one or two of the agencies there. Sometimes I think the agencies work at cross purposes. Ministry of Interior will be trying to arrest some of these people while some of the intelligence agencies seem to be cutting these people some slack. So there's some interesting tensions within, I think, the Russian state in this space as well. I sort of get on some of the groups. one of the ones that was probably familiar to many of you is the REvil group, which is an abbreviation of ransomware and evil. And the very name, I guess, is probably intended to cause a degree of fear in the people who hear about it or who are attacked by it. But when I talk about ransomware becoming a national security or an international security issue last year, 2001, I think there are a number of events, but the Kaseya attack in July, I think, helped focus the attention of the world, as did the Colonial Pipeline case around the same time, on ransomware as a problem for interference with critical infrastructure, with the operation of businesses. And the attack on a software as a service provider, Kaseya, meant that it went through, it spread very effectively through managed service providers into hundreds and hundreds of businesses across America, and a very effective business model to be launched by the REvil group. Just a little bit, I suppose, in terms of different structures of ransomware operations. This won't be perhaps news to some of you. You know, so there's the spray and pay model, which is perhaps what a lot of lower level ransomware operators used historically. You big spear phishing campaign, and you see what comes back. But then more recently, observers see what they call the big game hunting threat model, where there's a more deliberate, planned, premeditated, if you like, attack on a narrow group of targets. So one hears about the spray and pay model, and then the big game model as perhaps the one where things are evolving. And of course, I won't say much today, but cryptocurrencies have a big part, I think, in the sustainability of this model. And you know, one of the potential uses of ransomware is as a way of generating funds for states under sanction, and movement of money through cryptocurrencies means that they can bypass conventional banking systems. This slide, I think, points out sort of, if you like, a traditional model ransomware operator. But on the right side, we've got this kind of ransomware as a service model, which I think, again, is particularly significant when you think of groups like Conti, who basically have a series of affiliates who carry out a lot of the operations for them with software provided by the operator, the Conti operator in this case, and it could be things other than ransomware. But this is a kind of decentralized, outsourced sort of model that is common, I think. And the ransomware as a service model, I think, is quite enabling in terms of scaling up, in terms of bringing in a wider range of operators. Ransomware affiliates don't necessarily have to be super tech head, competent and cyber skills. They can be assisted through the operator, through provision of software to attack victims. So it's quite a kind of insidious, I guess, business model, and an effective one. So in the geo-strategic space, you know, and I've hinted, I guess, in different ways already, who's the enemy? I mean, you know, if one country attacks the other, if, you know, China invades Taiwan, it's all pretty clear, or Russia sends troops into Ukraine, it's pretty clear. But when you look at ransomware, particularly, not just ransomware, but as an offensive or malicious cyber operation, you see that striking at infrastructure, critical infrastructure, health services in the UK, the WannaCry and so on, the notion of who the victim is and their relationship back to the nation state is, I guess, much more diffuse and wide-ranging. That the idea that the West is one uniform enemy to entities such as the Russian state, I guess, permits the kind of patriotic hacker as well as the seasoned ransomware operator to say, well, you know, I mean, I'm making money out of Colonial Pipeline or JBS, the meat company, but, you know, I'm also doing something for my country at the same time. And of course, if by doing that, the Russian agencies or the nation state agencies behind them, of course, can see everybody's interests being met at the same time. Okay, so saying a bit about the Conti group, there's a sort of pedigree to a lot of these groups. They reshape, they rename periodically. The Conti group's linked by observers to another group called IFCYBER, a Russian hacktivist group. It's been around for about 4 or 5 years. John DiMaggio, who I'll refer to again later in this, who's been written extensively on ransomware in this space, describes them as Russia's most experienced ransomware attacker, possessing more tools, malware, and sophisticated capabilities. So this, in terms of evaluating the risk from the Conti group, I guess that's a pretty powerful statement. Believed to have undertaken more than 1,000 ransomware attacks, and under that ransomware as a service model, relies on networks of trusted affiliates to conduct different stages of the attack. And of course, you know, the thing about ransomware is it does require a number of stages: initial access, movement through networks, downloading of ransomware software. So it's often requires a greater degree of deliberation than something like a DDoS or certainly hacking. Another group that's come up, and my colleague David Wall said we've got to talk about Lockbit in the report because they're kind of rising in sort of prominence in the ransomware space. Another Russian associated group doesn't permit people, its associates, affiliates, to attack Russian, Eastern European language targets. But it claims not to be political and claimed to have a moral code which prevented it from attacking certain educational, charitable, social services targets. So it claims to be a bit more neutral, I think, I guess, than some of the other operators in this space, who are more like Conti, who's more avowed in its allegiances. Drawing a bit towards the end now, as I said, ransomware groups are very adaptive and capable of reinventing themselves. Brian Krebs, the man on the left there, basically just says that ransomware is constantly adapting. And of course, one of the motivations for doing that is its profitability. The millions of dollars that groups are being paid for ransoms for their work. But these organizational reboots, as Krebs says, are opportunities to move members in and out of the organization, create, I think, confusion in terms of processes of attribution and responsibility. So there's this constant kind of organic reshaping, I guess, around ransomware, which is perhaps not limited to ransomware in terms of other forms of cyber groups, but I think ransomware, the profit motivation as a form of organized crime, I think gives ransomware particular resilience, gives it a particular kind of motor engine that drives it forward, that I think, as I'll conclude, makes it particularly of ongoing significance in a strategic sense. You know, as well as the kind of political opportunities. But the economic, if you like, resilience will help drive some of the political outcomes from the future, as well as past uses of ransomware. So the question that's been behind, I guess, a lot of perhaps some of your thinking is, you know, there's other forms of cyber attacks, DDoS attacks, you know, again, why is it ransomware? And I've tried, I guess, to hint at some of that. And I think what's interesting for me, and thinking still about this further, finding out what are some of the, like the TTPs, if you like, of ransomware that give it a particular power, potency in the organized crime space, but also in the strategic space. And it strikes me that ransomware is what we could call a mobilization technology. Because of the profitability, there seems to be a kind of a self-generating source of involvement actors in this space. And it's a way of mobilizing for profit, simultaneously mobilizing for geopolitical ends as well. So it's a way of getting people in and orienting them in particular ways to questions of geopolitical significance, as well as financial self-benefit. You know, it has broad strategic application. You can use ransomware across a variety of spheres. You can target economic targets, critical infrastructure, and you can tell yourself that you're doing a service for your country. and your country may allow you to do so, so long as you don't attack them. It's an adaptable, resilient tool, ransomware, I think. It can be used in different ways. You know, we see it being used in double, triple extortion, the kind of playing of clients off against software providers and the targets of ransomware attacks, I think is, again, the kind of methods of organised crime that we see in non-cyber contexts. And there's a degree of redundancy in there. Ransomware as a service, you know, affiliates disappear, affiliates are cut out, new affiliates come forward, motivated often by money, as I said. And there's also kind of multi-dimensionality or functionality to ransomware. It has a kind of a threat, a menace, I think, in its just the mention of ransomware, and a lot of the kind of construction of ransomware as a public problem, I think, by people like Biden and others, helps generate and reinforce this fear element. But itself can sometimes be a mask or a distraction. We know that sometimes the semblance of ransomware is being used when in fact just a wipe-aware operation or some kind of cyber espionage operation or just data exfiltration is really the main purpose. So sometimes ransomware is a kind of a bit of a feint or a distraction, I think, from the traditional ransomware, but it still lends certain strategic benefits to those who are using it. So just to finish up, what's the future of ransomware, or the future in the context of the future of cyber operations? An expert in the sphere of Russian war and trends in cyber, Mark Galeotti, predicted, I think, a few years ago, 2019, that if Russia finally, decides to attack Ukraine or anybody else directly, it won't be through cyber. Cyber will be an adjunct, a kind of nibbling or distraction or a nuisance rather than a kind of the main game. And I think, since the 24th of February and more recently, we've seen that, cyber significance has tailed off a bit, and artillery and so on, traditional kinetic methods are being predominant in this space. I think, there is a challenge for criminologists, lawyers and others to know how, as a crime problem, how you tackle ransomware, following the money, cracking down on crypto. And I think there's been some success in that. The rewards that the United States Department of Justice doesn't seem to have yielded very much. So ability of law enforcement to deter, I think, is very limited. As I said, ransomware is really another example of resilient organised crime, like drug trafficking. There'll always be, I think, some group willing to carry forth in this space. And I think, ransomware has a future in that those sort of adjunct roles, supplementary roles, I think, and particularly where perhaps it can raise money to bypass sanctions and so on. And that dual functionality, the profit and the patriotism, I think, give it a real durability and salience for the future, in my view. So, Mike, that's the end. What I have here is a slide of John DiMaggio's book from earlier this year that I've used in developing this paper for the Global Initiative. It's interesting because he's a guy from the cybersecurity sector in the United States, agency background and so on, but he's written about, if you like, the criminology side, but also the kind of cybersecurity prevention side as well. So this book may be of interest to people interested in this topic. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Andrew. I thanks for your presentation. Look, we have about 10 scheduled minutes for questions. I'd note first of all, the response from Tom Worthington in the answered questions section, that linked to the SBS Cyber War documentary. We will put that on the web along with the presentation shortly. There are 3 questions that are open. I might start with Daniel's question. Andrew, I'll read it out. Daniel, if you find that it's inadequate, then please raise your hand, and probably Amy will unmute you. Daniel Kelly, so ransomware is a relatively simplistic brackets phishing delivery, end brackets. Is there evidence of these criminal groups doing things more often associated with state-based actors, such as theft of valid signing certificates?
I think, yeah, I probably can't get a very good answer to this question, but I mean, I think as Daniel points out, phishing has been a common way of doing it, for the sort of spray and pay approaches. But I don't know about specific, I mean, there are people who could give you the other methods, including possibly the one you're mentioning there, but I think the kind of big game hunting model, there's less reliance on that. So I think there's been a movement away. I mean, people like Maggio could probably nail this question, but I think certainly there's growing sophistication in ways of targeting, not relying on phishing. But I don't know anybody who's knows a lot about that particular topic. So maybe I'll just leave it at that for now. But I think there's certainly a move away from relying on phishing, which was one of the early approaches.
Thank you. Look, Sanjay asked a question very early on relating to when you were talking about the data that was being collected. He asked, how is the data being collected for the various types of attacks by the various organisations tracking this criminal behaviour?
Okay. I see his first part of his question, which I think...
Sorry, it's in the answered questions, Andrew.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think in the answered questions.
Yes.
Oh, I see. Okay. Because
Yeah.
I mean, one of the... Okay. I mean, there's the one that's on my screen. I mean, this is from Sanjay as well, is it?
Yep. Yep.
First question, just let me think about, I'll go to that one in a second. I mean, one of the things that interests me in this space is, the question is, does cybercrime equal cybersecurity? And I think that, to me, that's a really interesting question. And as a criminologist, I'm astonished that so many people in the cybersecurity space talk about, they equate the two. I mean, you read a report on cybersecurity and immediately they're talking about the bad actors and the cyber criminals and so on. And, it's an interesting question that I think partly that my presentation is trying to, or that theme is trying to unpack, is to what extent is cybersecurity just about cybercrime? Maybe it's a lot about cybercrime, but there's not a lot of cybercriminology, I think, in cybersecurity. And I think that, there's an opportunity, I guess, in terms of convergence of fields to explore that further. So I think, very often I think people use cybersecurity to mean cybercrime, but I'm not sure they necessarily have a very developed concept of cybercrime in mind when they do so. But that's kind of a practice that seems to have emerged over time. Look, to me, how is the data collected? I can't answer that question. I know that some of the, and I have to go back to my notes, some of the ransomware attacks or putative ransomware attacks have used cyber espionage tools to kind of collect data, clearly for other purposes. I mean, I think it was either Lockbit or Conti in my notes. There was a particular CDO, I think it's called SCIDOH, that might mean something to some of you. As I said, I'm a criminologist, not a techie, but why would a ransomware group, a crime group, have cyber espionage software in its ransomware payload? Clearly there's a kind of geopolitical or political possibility in that. So, there are, I guess, forms of cyber espionage software that are being used by some of these groups to collect, but I can't, I'm not technically capable to answer that question beyond that.
Andrew, thanks for a very interesting talk. Are you able to hear me?
Sanjay, yes, thank you, Sanjay.
Okay, good. Now, actually, attribution is a challenge, and that's why I was kind of asking this question as to how easy or hard it is to attribute any of these things to, say, Russian groups or that group, because a lot of this would be guesswork. So I was curious in that sense. But more importantly, coming back to the question that asked you, is cybercrime equal to cybersecurity? This goes the other way around as well. Like the docs attack, for example. Now, you can't stop people from publishing, so no cybersecurity solution can fix that, in my opinion. Or if you look at romance fraud, now, the only way you can stop is that you stop video or audio communication, right? But you can't stop people from talking to each other or giving their credit card or bank details. And so I'm just wondering, are those kind of things, like sometimes people claim to be cybersecurity experts, even though they are doing something else. How does that work? Like, does cybercrime equate to cybersecurity all the time? The ones you have quoted are fantastic examples in terms of ransomware and many other examples. That definitely is technical issue there, and you need cybersecurity experts to be able to handle those things.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, my focus is obviously in this developing this report has been to focus on ransomware, and I mean, certainly cyber criminologists are interested in romance, and you know, Monica Whitty, who's have a history, your previous director there before Mike, certainly was very much in that space, and of course, various activities of sextortion and you know, cyberbullying. I mean, these are very much treated as forms of cybercrime, which, as you say, perhaps have a much more social engineering rather than sort of technical dimensions to them. In fact, you know, certain those areas get a lot of attention from criminologists, probably because of that social dimension and the psychology of behind things like those activities of bullying and romance scams and so on. But I think, you know, that the interface between what is cybersecurity out there at large and where is cybercrime, I think it's an interesting one. And people like Monica Whitty, I guess, historically have tried to bridge that space. Maybe Monica's listening out there. She could speak for herself, I guess, but maybe she's not.
I don't think she is. Andrew, I just want to get to Tom. People are dropping off, but just want to get to Tom Worthington's question. And I think this dialogue's got to go on and on, Andrew and Sanjay and co. I think, thank you very much. But Tom, Tom asks, does the relationship between pardon me, not as well asked as I might have, how does the relationship between cyber criminals and the state differ between Russia and China?
I mean, that's a great question. And I guess, you know, one would need to look at it more closely to be more confident about the degree of similarity. I mean, I think what's interesting, where the similarities do lie, in terms of essentially you've got authoritarian systems that historically have tolerated crime groups up to a point. My observation would be that Russia's relation to organised crime has been far more extensive, far more open, far more exploitative than what I've seen or what I know about Chinese cyber criminal groups. And you know, I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, there'd be much more outsourcing, much more delegation to cybercrime groups, I think, in Russia, given the histories that have been visible for the last, as I said, some people say Russia has been a mafia state since 1917, which is an amazing call. I mean, nobody would say, I've never heard anybody say China has been a mafia state. And behind that, I guess what I'm saying is I would expect that cyber offensive activities would have a stronger state footprint in the Chinese case, just based on the history of operations around a number of other spheres, off cyber as well as on cyber.
Tom, did you want to follow up there, mate?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
I can, Tom.
Yes, we can.
I just had a follow-up question. Can Australia make use of cyber criminals, or is the loss of reputation too high? I mean, our police forces do routinely make use of criminals by, you know, turning them into informants and that sort of thing. And most famously, where they got into one of the supposedly secure apps for communication on phones and took down lots of criminals. Could this be used more widely in cyber war?
Yeah, I think I mean, as somebody who's spent a lot of time historically looking at policing as well as organised crime, it's a very problematic space when you start using informants and you know, even though it's happened as a matter of practice, I think the problems associated with that and the regulation of that have often flared up and bitten back and been deemed to be prices too high to pay. I mean, of course, the theoretical possibility is there, I guess, for police to do that. You know, in some states of Australia, Queensland, you know, they have some pretty powerful legislation, world-beating legislation that gives police the freedom to assume identities and stuff online. And in fact, you know, police in the Netherlands and the States and elsewhere have relied upon some of those unique powers of the Queensland Police historically to investigate online pedophilia rings. So sometimes the state can, you know, some states of Australia at least can take on that role. I mean, I think one of the interesting things to consider in this space is, you know, how do criminologists get people to desist from crime? How would you get people to kind of come across from doing this stuff to the good guy side, if you like, not necessarily to be double agents, but really how do you sort of seduce them across into being law-abiding people? And I think if you're looking at something on the scale of Russia, it's probably a massive challenge. But there's a parallel with something called Operation Paperclip from the World War II that some strategic science studies historians might know, where basically the Americans were paying Nazi scientists to come across and join them. So, I mean, finding ways to kind of bring people over, bring them in, but you know, you'd probably want to bring in your Bogachevs or something, not your average hacktivist at home. But yeah, how you can kind of get people out of that space and across into another space, I think, is something that is worth thinking about from a restorative or rehabilitative approach, not necessarily from a strategic and investigative one. But yeah, I think our legal system might have some difficulties with doing, obviously, parallel things to what's going on in Russia.
Thank you.
Andrew, thanks for your time. Look, I think what we'll do is we'll bring the session to a close here. I think if you're happy, Andrew, we can have further questions, maybe go through Amy, and by email back to you, and we can publish some commentary on the website. I think that is useful for all of us. I think, you know, 20 or so people coming in at 9 o'clock for the things, perhaps some from their bedrooms. Andrew, of course, is half an hour different from us, and he's probably desperate for a coffee at this point in Adelaide. Look, thank you all. Thank you, everyone. Andrew, we'll be in touch some more. Amy, thanks for your piece. Is there any more, Amy, that we need to do here? If you,
no, that's all. Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to the attendees and the questions. And yeah, we'll get this ready to be shared as well, the recording.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Amy and Mike, for the opportunity to bring my thinking into the sort of more mainstream cybersecurity space. I value these sorts of opportunities. Thank you.
And thank you for bringing your bit. Cheers.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.